psychology is the science of consciousness. So to explore the foundations of psychology, we have to begin with Descartes. Now, it's very fashionable, it has been fashionable, at least up until very recently, to denounce Descartes. In fact, I put some praise for Descartes up on the Facebook site a while ago to see what would happen. And the vitriol that was directed at this guy was amazing. People accused him of torturing dogs and all sorts of things. So I have to ask the question, who is today prepared to say with Descartes, as he did more than 300 years ago, that thought and matter, consciousness and matter are two categorically different things? Okay? And this is the first thing. If psychology is the science of consciousness, we have to begin to look at this question of the fundamental difference between consciousness and matter. Now, we like to say, oh, nothing's black and white, there's not good and bad, there's not even male and female, they're always halfway in betweens and blurry edges, right? That's all very well, but the fact remains, thought and matter are two entirely and categorically different things. Now, just briefly about Descartes. The reason that we have to begin with him is he effectively discovered the concept of consciousness. It may seem a surprising thing, how can you not know about consciousness? But in actual fact, it hadn't previously, in modern European history, been looked upon as an object and talked about. Now, the reason that Descartes did this is because he was a profound skeptic. He did not believe in received knowledge, in the book knowledge handed down from the ancients, because in 1600 and something, people decided questions of science by consulting what it said in the Bible or what Aristotle had said on the subject, right? Which included all sorts of crazy claims, as we know. Right? On the other hand, particularly in certain parts of the world, such as in England, but not exclusive in England, there was this wonderful movement of empiricism, where people were going out in nature, ignoring the old books and using their own eyes to look at God's works to understand how nature worked. But Descartes equally was absolutely naive. You cannot trust the old books, you cannot trust what's given to you by your senses. For all you know, you could be asleep and dreaming. Maybe this is all a great illusion. But if you want to create science, right, and Descartes is such a beginning here, if you want a science, you have to have some point of certainty to start with. But what is certain? You know, maybe we're all, maybe I'm the Queen of Sheba and I'm dreaming all this. I don't know. How do I know? Okay, so the other question that confronted him was this. Descartes invented coordinate geometry. He could do some scribbles with algebra and things on a bit of paper and tell an artilleryman what angle to fire his cannon to get over a distant wall of a city under siege, for example. How was it possible to do some scribbling on a bit of paper and some calculations, and then a steel cannonball would fly through the air according to your calculations? Yeah? If thought and matter were two entirely different things, as it appears at first sight they are, how was it possible that you could do some thinking and that the material world would act according to your thoughts? So it's never a question, of course, that Descartes thought that thought and matter weren't connected. The whole point was they obviously were connected, but how were they connected? Now, people often say in response to this problem, well, thought is material, we've given up all this old spiritual stuff, thought is material. But that's just self-contradictory and not understanding the question at all. Because what matter is exactly what's outside consciousness. So to say my consciousness is material is just missing the whole point of the question. If I think I've got $10 in my pocket, that's a thought, right? If I stick my hand in my pocket and count it up and say, oh, it's $9, that's a different thing. And if I don't realise the difference between my thought and what is the case out there in the world beyond my thought, then I'm mad. I'm absolutely off the planet, right? That these are two categorically different things. Thought and matter. Now, what you're thinking is a different matter. What you're thinking, your consciousness, is out there in the world outside of my consciousness, and I can only discover what you're thinking by observation. Same as if I want to know the room temperature or understand the force of gravity. Through observation and experiment, I can work out your consciousness. But my consciousness is how the whole world is given to me. So my starting point, as if I'm interested in science, and rather than writing stream of consciousness or literature, is to recognise the categorical difference between thought and matter. The way Descartes proceeded then is this. What he thinks may be completely mistaken. What he sees may be a complete illusion. But what he does know is that he's conscious. And that because he is thinking, something must be thinking, therefore he knows he exists. That's not much. He may be completely deluded about what he thinks, but because he's thinking, he knows that he exists. The other thing is, not only must it be the case that he exists, but something else bigger than him must exist as well in order that he think. Right? So that was his starting point. Now he got into problems which are famous, the Cartesian dualism and so on, because he set off from an ontological claim about thought and matter and the distinction between them in order to solve what was actually an epistemological problem, a problem about the theory of knowledge. And this led to a mistake. It wasn't wrong to say that thought and matter are two quite different things. What he was wrong about was hoping to solve the problem of knowledge by setting off from that distinction. It turned it into a kind of natural scientific problem, where in actual fact it has to be approached as a subject-object relation, which requires some philosophical work before you can come back and understand basically how a human being works. Now, after Descartes, Spinoza is the philosopher who's famous for struggling to overcome this dualism by, instead of saying, well, we can see God's work, and we can work out what's going on by looking at that, he said, well, there is just one substance. We're just given one thing, which is God, and God has two attributes, extension and thought, and we're part of that, so it's all just one thing. Right? But the problem with that, although he found what appears to be a solution for Descartes' dualism, he kept the mechanical theory of Descartes' mechanical approach to nature. So consequently, by being part of this one thing which operated according to mechanical laws, our lives are totally determined and fatalistic. And apart from that, over a couple of hundred years, philosophy unfolded by what I'd say is a rational critique of empiricism. That's to say, people trying to work out how from sense impressions we can learn about the world, and then other people showing, but no, look, all you're getting is your sense impressions. That's not what's out in the world, that's something different. And it wound up in either Bishop Berkeley with complete subjective idealism, like solipsism, if you say, that it's all an illusion, or you wind up with Hume saying, well, yes, we can see things, you can make practical decisions about what to do, but you can't know necessity. It's just like doing statistics. You can't know what's absolutely necessary. Now, human consciousness can be made the object of science, and it's absolutely necessary to. Consciousness arises by the interaction between two objective processes, human behaviour and human physiology. But in itself, it's an appearance. It's an illusion. And we have to always recognise that our consciousness is an appearance. And we have to continually struggle to get behind that appearance. Huh? Now, I'd like to just stop there at the moment. This thing, of course, will continue moving on, but we'll deal with that. What do people think? Are people prepared to accept what I've said here? I often find there's a lot of resistance to this idea that there's a categorical difference between thought and matter. People find that's totally reactionary, in fact, to say such a thing. It's got to be something halfway in between, something that's half thought, half matter, or something, surely. People clear about what I mean by matter and what I mean by consciousness in a sense?
May I
Yes.
query you on what you talked about as the mechanical nature of
Yes. Yeah.
you're talking about Descartes?
Yeah, look, he's writing in the sort of 1630s, 1640s. So he's writing after Newton, but the only concepts of causality and natural processes that existed at the time were mechanical laws, and specifically those got as far as hydraulic laws. So the human body was understood as a hydraulic system, right? But I'm subsuming hydraulic under mechanical. Yeah, so just as today people say, oh, well, the human brain is just a computer, whatever the latest stage of development of science is, people say, oh, that's what we are. Right? It's a bit of a tendency that's kept going the last 400 years. And people discover it like, we're a network. And the brain's just a network, is it? Because that's the latest discovery of science.
This, the notion of mind over matter has been very modern, hasn't it?
Yes.
Put mind over, like all the... Yes. What do you have to say about how that works?
We'll come back to that sort of dominance relation a bit later. Generally speaking, say materialists are those who give priority to matter, and that our thinking is determined by matter, whereas idealists are those that give dominance to ideas with enough, like young people are interviewed on the telly to just run a race or something, and they'll come on and say, whatever you want to do in life, you can do it. And some kid that's got no legs thinks, oh, that's great, It's very fashionable at the moment to say you can do anything, right? And sometimes it goes the other way. You find it's fashionable to say, well, everything's determined by our environment and so on. We'll come to that a bit later when we get to Marx. Descartes should not be lumped in either camp there. Right? He was what's called a rationalist, that he advised, don't trust your senses, don't trust the old books, use your noggin, right? Critique, think about it. And that makes him not particularly an idealist or a materialist. And I would never use either of those words as terms of abuse. They're just one side or the other of the question. Okay? That was the state of the matter really up until the late 18th century. And to find the real roots of cultural historical activity theory, we have to go to late 18th, early 19th century Germany, particularly the Romantic reaction to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is well known, and its foremost philosopher was Kant. But there was a reaction to the Enlightenment, which is really where the particular current of thought that we're talking about here comes from. What the Enlightenment did, it overcame superstition, religion, particularism, privilege by saying there are universal human rights, universal obligations that we determine by reason. Every human being has a capacity to reason, which is a universal capacity. So the Enlightenment, and not only did people have access to reason, but they had also intuition or sensation. So what the Enlightenment did, and most clearly expressed in Kant, without question, whatever I will say about him now, one of the greatest philosophers of all time in Europe. But what he did is he, on one hand, flattened out human beings into a uniform type. All possessed of uniform, universal rights and capacities. On the other hand, he broke up the person into little bits. And the dualism, which had been, they were struggling to overcome for 200 years before that, was actually still remained with Kant. You had the thing in itself, which was outside of your experience and was in principle unknowable, because all you can know is knowledge. You can't put things out there into your head, right? And on the other hand, appearances. But he did re-establish some kind of rational basis for science, and people like Noam Chomsky and Jean Piaget, which will be known to people here, go with Kant. They base their work in Kant. But there was a reaction to that, and the philosopher I want to focus here is the Romantic philosopher Herder. And Herder, when you look at what we know today, and you're talking about someone who's writing in 1770 or 1780, right, a long time ago, and he said that firstly, he's known really as a philosopher of history, and he introduced the term Zeitgeist and Volksgeist, that is, the spirit of the times and the spirit of a people. And he wanted to inquire into what determined these things. Where did the spirit of a people come from? And he was also interested in not only in the difference between how one people thought and how another people thought, and how the ways of thinking changed from time to time, but also how thinking was individual, that no two people saw the world in quite the same way. And the reason for that is that he defined thinking as working with symbols. Working with symbols wasn't the cause of thinking, that's what thinking was. And he made his name at the age of 26 in 1770 something, writing an essay on the origins of language. And I've only skimmed through this essay at the moment, but it's a pretty good go at the origins of language. And it involves, he mainly bases it on the social imperative of being able to communicate with other people and how they used what was available. But basically, according to what you were involved in and the tools and artifacts that you were working with, you would learn to think and you would learn to speak. And language, being among the things you used to work with, was the substance, therefore, of thought. Now, there's two specific ideas of Herder that I have to go to, once we've recognised really how remarkably similar to us that he is. We'll make the qualification. Goethe said that great discoveries are made not by individuals but by their age. And Herder was part of a whole movement which benefited from the Enlightenment but was able to go beyond it. Now, these two ideas which I want to pick up on. Firstly, I mentioned Spinoza. Spinoza was denounced as an atheist, and his works were beyond the pale. I mean, being he was Jewish, I can say he was beyond the pale, literally. Right? They were banned. You could not talk about Spinoza except to denounce him. Herder rehabilitated Spinoza, but in the process of doing that, he modified him. Herder said that nature is full of opposing forces. It's full of striving and struggle, and tensions and opposition. These factors are not something that are the gift of thinking human beings, but nature itself is full of this activity. And it's natural. So the God nature, he was a pantheist, right? That God isn't something behind the world, something that created the world. God is the world, and we are part of that. Same as people say, I don't believe in God, I just believe in nature. So, oh yeah, you're just calling God nature. Right? Well, I remember when I first discovered that, reading the introduction to a book on Spinoza, what a revelation it was. I'd always thought I was such a great atheist, but in fact, all scientists are people that, well, no, that would be exaggerating it to say that there's no difference, because science is a very specific form of practice. But if you're looking at 1780 or something in Germany, the way science emerged was this idea through pantheism. Okay, but God or nature for Herder was active, striving, struggling with opposition, and human beings were a part of that. Right? And it became respectable. The other thing which I've discovered about Herder, which is very interesting, he had this concept of Schwerpunkt, which is a word that has in German many different meanings. I can't get the same translation of two different German speakers. I call it strong point. I mean, German's a wonderful language like that. It's full of these words that have so many different shades of meaning. That's to say, it's that activity which is defining for that people. It's what they do, it's what they're about. It gives them their meaning. And he said you can't separate a people from their Schwerpunkt. And it's the same with the individual people. Every individual person has their particular strong point. And you can't separate the person from that strong point. It would break them as a person to do that. Right? So this is how he proceeded to try and understand a people. to look at the range of activities and ideas and their history, and out of that to try and find what was sometimes called their centre of gravity, but I find strong point better. And so the importance of this we'll see as we go on. I want to move now to Goethe. Goethe was a good mate of Hegel. Goethe he was a European, his first European celebrity. He wrote a book called The Sorrows of Young Werther when in his 20s. It was translated into every European language. It became a total sensation. And even when he travelled, he had to travel incognito because he would be flooded by fans. And you're talking about, again, the 1780s. He was not only a poet, but he administered the civil service in Weimar for about 10 years. He even ran the mining industry. Right? So he was a very practical person, and he was a very gifted poet, and he was also a natural scientist. But he was part of the leading figure of what's called romantic science. And picking up from Herder's critique of the Enlightenment, he was very hostile to what he called Newtonian science. I don't want to make this into a slander session against Newton either, who was an amazing person in his own right. But there was a whole movement which wanted to break everything down into the smallest bits and then assemble the whole out of the bits. So the starting point for romantic science was how to grasp things as a whole. Now again, this wonderful German language has a word for this, and it's called Gestalt. Now Gestalt's a common word in German. It also means form or shape or formation or figure. A German speaker described it to me, if you say what a fine figure of a man, then that word figure sort of best captures what Gestalt means. But it's a very common word, but in German it has this very specific meaning as well. As we say, when you translate it in English, we just call it Gestalt, because there's no English word to communicate that. It means as a whole. Now, the point I want to deal with Goethe is how he went about doing this. How do you grasp things as a whole? People endlessly tell you, oh, you have to start from the whole, right? And so commonly people will mention a word which points to the whole, right? As the word whole does itself. And this is not sufficient for starting from the whole. People will instead perhaps take some attribute of a thing, say all the things with this particular attribute belong to this category. Right? And that is, of course, the very opposite of starting from the whole. It's starting from just one contingent attribute of something. Or people, I'm running ahead of Goethe a bit here, the structural approach, which instead of dealing with the actual real things, such as people that are in front of you, you say you have a structure, and that structure is sort of determining what everyone does and thinks behind the scenes. Or famously, you have a law or a principle, such as the law of gravity or the law of attraction or some other law of this or principle of that. Now the problem is that when you, and this was following in the wake of Newton, up till today is the predominant method of science. You observe a phenomenon. Phenomenon means what appears to you, and you try and determine the law that's behind it. I can't say this isn't useful, right? This is part of the history of science. But the problem with it is, whereas you started with something that's given to you, which you can see with your senses, with this principle you end up with something that's really completely mysterious. You can't see it, you can't hold it. You know, it's just asserted, right? So how can you grasp something as a whole? And the profound gift that Goethe made to science was this concept of Urphänomen. Urphänomen. Ur is this little particle which sort of means archetypal or basic, as people might have heard in literary criticism. You talk about urtext. So it's the fundamental archetypal appearance. Right? Now, I don't think Goethe was completely clear on this whole idea, but I'll try and give you an idea of it. In 1784, while Herder was writing his book on Spinoza, Goethe travelled north to south and up again through Italy, observing plants and doing sketches and botanical sketches of all the different plants he saw. And his aim was to try and find what was the basic underlying form of everything he saw which made it a plant. You know, what was it? Why was a plant a plant? And he wanted to do a drawing of the plants, yeah? the archetypal plant. Now, he died in 1832, and microscopes got to a point of being able to see cells, I think in a few years after he died. And most people recognised that with the discovery of a cell, a phenomenon that shows you how a plant works and has all the characteristics of that plant and will unfold out of itself the plant which it is. His idea is vindicated. Right? This is a very good idea. And the next writer, no, look, I think we will just stop there for a bit of a brief discussion. Are we okay with this idea of phenomenon? It's very hard to explain this really clearly because you can't just give an example. Every time you try and give an example, it sort of tends to fly off on a tangent, right? Because you can't just say, take a phenomenon, oh, the phenomenon is this. Because the phenomenon represents a profound insight into how a complex process works. It's, generally speaking, in the history of science, the culmination of decades, if not centuries, of study to arrive at that simple process that's given to the senses. I find it useful sometimes to think of, if you imagine a little lever like this, and just, I haven't brought an example with me, but just a little block and a little stick and play with it and try it. And you have there what's called the principle of mechanical advantage. And really out of that, the entirety of mechanical engineering can be unfolded, a basic principle. You don't need Archimedes' law of the lever or any such thing. Just play around with the lever, you get the idea. Right? So what you're looking at there is the only way, what is a concept, you see? A concept is not necessarily something sort of psychic and spatial and ephemeral. It can be given to the senses. Right? And this was directly in the face of Kant. Right? We're going on to Hegel now, because Hegel was a great admirer of Goethe. I mean, he worshipped Goethe. Right? And what he did is he took that phenomenon and made it into what I call the phenomenon of his philosophy, a basic idea out of which Hegel's whole philosophy can be unfolded. Now, whereas Kant had solved Descartes' problem up to the point of addressing the subject-object relation rather than a mind-matter problem. The difference is that the subject-object relation is just, it's answering the question of how can one system replicate the properties of another system. And it's a problem that can be approached in general philosophical or even mathematical terms. It's not solved under a microscope or with a scalpel. And that's helpful, because it allowed a number of things to be clarified. But it still left you with a dichotomy, in fact. Subject over here, object over there. How can the properties of this get into that? Right? What Hegel did, which is so brilliant, is he moved beyond a subject-object dichotomy. He took the subject-object as a single thing. Later comes to object and subject, but he begins from a subject-object. And he's able to do that with this idea of a thought object, which in common language is an artifact. It's a product of the mind, but it's a material object. You can hold it in your hand. Right? And when you use a spanner, you get the idea of a threaded screw. You get the. In fact, if people are aware of Merstiakov, in a spoon, from a spoon you can unfold the entirety of human civilization. The whole process of sitting at the table, taking food off the spoon and so on. So it's really, instead of talking about we human beings over here and nature over there, which is not solved, in fact, by being a pantheist, he looked at the relationship between individual human beings and our own culture, which we create, which we participate in, and which we continue and reconstruct. So what a culture is made up of thought objects, all the tools, symbols, buildings, domestic animals, and so on. The kind of things that you find in an archaeological dig. Right? But they're thought objects because when they're part of a in fact, I'll introduce this new word now. a formation of consciousness, then they take on a living kind of form. Now, formation, that word is a translation of Gestalt, Gestalt der Bewusstsein. It's a typical Hegelian phrase. Marx would probably call it formation, a social formation. But what it means is it's a way of thinking, a way of life, and a constellation of artifacts all together. So it's a form of life. But when you look at that form of life, that integrally includes the language, the artifacts, the herds, if that's where you're at, or machinery that you have, and the way of life. That's the entirety, not only of productive processes, but the legal forms and the social forms, and the way of thinking. And these things are clearly interrelated to each other, but they're not necessarily identified. People can carry on a certain practice while their thoughts are really somewhere else. Yeah? And sometimes you have objects, including language, which can carry a certain meaning for one person, but a different meaning for another, or object tools that are used, perhaps manufactured for one purpose, but used for another. So what Hegel did in the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is his most famous book, but I don't recommend it as a starting point. Please don't say, it's very fashionable to read that book and think you've read Hegel. It's his first book, he made his name with it, but only 250 copies were printed in his entire lifetime. He used to give them away to friends, and rightly so, because it's almost unreadable. But nevertheless, it was an effort to do something which is really very profound. He wanted to show how these different formations of consciousness succeeded one another. He tried to grasp different forms of life as a whole. So to do that, he had to draw on Goethe's idea. At the centre of every formation of consciousness is a concept which is like where the buck stops. Now, I should say, although Hegel talked about formations of consciousness very much as if he's talking about a whole society or even a whole world at a certain stage in history, it's really much better today in a modern society to think of it as a project. I mean, science is a formation of consciousness. It has its various practices, its literature, its ideas, its thou shalt nots and thou shalls, right? Typical formation of consciousness. Socialism is another one. Education is another one. Right? It might be a little thing. It might be Essendon Football Club. It might be the Forsyte Saga. Okay, these are projects, and at the centre of each project is like their Fairpoint, their Urphenomena, the concept around which they're organised. And what Hegel showed is that at a certain point, if a formation of consciousness is alive, it continually subjects its central concept to criticism. It's sceptical about its own beliefs, and at a certain point, as the meaning of some concept is worked through actively and developed, at a certain point it falls into a crisis and it can't sustain itself. And some other arrangement has to be worked out, a new concept has to be determined. And through that, by looking at a whole form of life as being made up of concepts with a central concept which is characterising the whole form of life at it, it was a way of trying to grasp social dynamics. Now, out of that, he wrote a logic, and most of the Marxists, for instance, of the period when Vygotsky was alive, up until the 1960s, mostly went to the logic to understand. And Hegel gives us in the logic his version of the Urphenomenon, which is the subject. Now, I just want to read you a bit of a letter from Hegel to Goethe to make this clear, that this really happened. Hegel's writing to Goethe, and he says, "What is simple and abstract you strikingly call the Urphenomenon. You place at the very beginning. You then show how the intervention of further spheres of influence and circumstances generates the concrete phenomena. and you regulate the whole progression so that the succession proceeds from the simple condition to the more composite, so that the complex now appears in full clarity through this decomposition, to ferret out the phenomenon, to free it from those further environs which are accidental to it, to apprehend, as we say, abstractly. This I take to be truly scientific knowledge. So it's very explicitly picked up on Goethe's idea of how to grasp and understand a complex whole like a form of life, to get to its concept. Now, what Hegel did with that is his concept wasn't just a name, it wasn't just an attribute, that's attached to something, right? He uses this individual, particular, and universal. Now, I'm trying to. And he always delivers this in the form of logical syllogisms on that totally send you crazy trying to read it, right? But what it means is this: that you can have an individual thing, that's okay, but that's not a concept, is it? It's just a thing. But to be a concept, I have to somehow connect, say, to lectern. Lectern is a word that it can be verbal or it can be written in letters, right? So it's a universal, it's a form of representation that every time I utter it, I recreate and continue that universal by saying lectern, translate it into another language, whatever, right? And by pointing to it like that, oh, something happened, anyway. I particularize it. I say this is a lectern, okay? So if I take an idea, a more abstract idea like unionism, something close to my heart, took up a good middle part of my life, unionism can only exist if there are actual people that believe in it and practice it and use it and exercise solidarity and so on. If that didn't exist, then you couldn't have the concept. Okay, of course, if it all died out 20 years ago, people would still hear about it, and it would be a correspondingly thin and abstract concept. Right? But it is a concept only because it really exists. So you must have that practice, and you must have people. You can't have unionism just as an ideal. People have to be practicing it, and practicing it has to be by actual people. Right? So there has to be individuals doing it. There has to be some particular form. There have to be particular unions. You have to have the AEU, the Teachers' Union, NTEU, and so unless you have actual unions, particular unions, you can't have unionism. Right? So you must have particular unions, individuals who are members of them, and the universal, the whole idea of it, the concept of unionism. And that concept has to be embodied in the particular unions. There are unions now that have forgotten all about what it means, and that also undermines and weakens the concept. And of course, people who belong to the unions have an idea what they belong to. So, but to the extent to which those are all together, that the individuals understand the idea and participate in the appropriate practices, then you have a real concept. And that's what Hegel's talking about. Right? But it's delivered in such an arcane way, it's difficult to understand. Now, I'm just going to finish up with just a couple of comments about Hegel. Look, he was an idealist. When you understand what he's getting at, it's very useful and profound and practical. But he did think that history unfolded according to powerful ideas. Right? Behind the backs of people thinking them, history wasn't made according to the intentions of any great leader or anything, but it was ideas which drove history. And that's a problem. Right? And it's not his only problem. Right? So we'll get to some critique of Hegel, and there are many ways you could critique him, but it's important he retains his usefulness and fame to this day for very good reasons. And the other thing is he did have his own psychology, and it's the best expression of that psychology, I think, is given by George Herbert Mead, if people are familiar with Mead. It basically says you get to know yourself through other people. I know Gloria a little bit. Gloria gives feedback to me. No, that's nice. Gloria sees me in that way, whatever. So I get a feeling about myself. I get to know myself. And that's what Mead developed. And he's quite explicit. He says, he's quoted in one of his letters saying that he's done his best to do what Hegel was doing in the Phenomenology, which is where this first appears. But that's only a small part of what Hegel has to offer. right? Mainly, what he has to offer is not so much his own theory about how individuals come to be thinking, but what thought is and what an idea is. Yeah? And his idea of a concept, such as I illustrated in the previous diagram about individual universe in particular. And once you can decode what's meant by these, it really comes to life. And the concept isn't just some thought form which is invisible and floats around something like a Jungian collective consciousness or something. It's an observable thing. You can see it. And you can learn about it by watching how people use a concept, what they call it, what it means to different people. And so it's a concept that is as much a subject of observation and experiment as anything else. Right? So it's a firm basis for beginning a science. And it was really only Hegel that really nailed that down. But very few people today really, outside of people that study Hegel or Vygotsky or Marx or something, have an idea what a concept is. So it's worth knowing. Okay, let's just have a chat about that for a minute.
I think that's really helpful, that picture of the concept and explaining it like that. That makes sense to me for the first talk. Good.
Yes, it should. And I tell you, it took me years and years and years of banging my head on Hegel's logic to realise what the hell he was going on about with this individual universe in particular. And generally I find it's a closed book to most people. I know I studied Lenin's notes. That's how I got into Hegel in the first place as a good, old-fashioned communist. I don't read Hegel, I read Lenin's commentary on Hegel, right? Which is what Vygotsky did too, I might say. Lenin just skipped over this whole section on this. He's an idealist. Absurd. Right? Which is a pity, because the embodiment of communism is a party. And if you understand this, that you're actually making a concept and putting a concept into the world to fulfill itself, but not in an idealist way, but as a practical project. If you understand concepts as projects, as forms of life that have ideals and are carried out by people and so on, then Hegel suddenly opens up a whole wonderful philosophy of in all sorts of branches and sub-stages, a very rich, complex and very rigorous philosophy all around social organisation in that way.
So can it be ideas as well? A concept? Can it be an idea that people practice the idea?
The idea, yes. In fact, you can't have a concept unless it's to some extent practiced. Yeah. Now, you can stretch that. If you read an old book about what they did in Egypt or something.
But does it have? Well, I guess my question is it visible, or can it be they're still practicing, but they're not aware that it is?
Yes, the concept is visible and it's an empirically given thing, because you see people doing the thing. People say, what are you coming in here for? It's a strike. What do you mean it's a strike? This means you stop work, right? It's, that's what it means. I always wondered about that. So that's how we learn, isn't it? In fact, in the XMCA list this morning, that there's was it you, Sue, that give that big translation about what Gennady had said, or was somebody else? Sorry? College, right. In teaching science, the first thing they do is they get the children involved in scientific practices, measuring things, sorting things out into categories, those kind of basic practices which are part of science. And on that basis, you can then get them to reflect on their practice. Yeah? So the idea is not enough to say, we're going to do science, okay? Now get to it, be scientific. Utterly meaningless, of course, because it's just a word. How can you grasp what that word is? How can you grasp, in other words, the concept which is represented by that universal? One thing you need is practices.
Can it be a feeling?
Human beings are feeling. Yeah, human beings are feelings. The object of a concept, what it's in a sense telling you about the world, it's by no means in any sense exclusive of feelings. I mean, it's about human beings. It's about forms of life. And these are all feelings. Yeah?
In this, beautiful little triangle here, the black sheep and the collective, where does the shared is this where the shared intention of the union comes in, and then there's always someone else with a new idea that comes in?
I hope the picture of the sheep and the black sheep is simply a visual that will stick in your mind and help you remember that. Right? Don't try and read too much symbolism into what I'm saying.
I'm reading the symbols here.
So, Andy, for example, is storytelling a concept?
Yes, storytelling is a concept, and it continues to exist and be understandable to us because people go on telling stories, and from an early age we do. It's also a way of carrying concepts, of course. If you want to teach, for instance, a rolling stone gathers no moss, you can tell a story that illustrates that. And I suppose that's, look, life is very rich, and how concepts actually live and are conveyed and modified. I don't want to reduce that to some kind of formula. That's the work of you practicing psychologists to do that. My role here is just to draw attention to what a concept is. And we know, of course, that narratives are an important way in which concepts are made real for people. Yeah? And that's, I'm sure, a subject for a whole talk in itself.
I think the notion of concept as project was very helpful for me. Because this Italian school system, progettazione, another word which you can't really explain, is helped with this. It's actually exactly like that.
Yeah. There are a number of writers that use this word project in very similar ways. Jean-Paul Sartre, for instance, uses it, but the project which makes you who you are comes from within. And that doesn't fit very well with cultural historical activity theory, because we know that we build ourselves out of what's around us. We don't discover it. We may feel that we discover it from within, and that represents a real human experience, but it's not an appropriate way. There's a fellow by the name of, was it Schmidt? Some Hegel interpreters, such as Terry Pinkard, also use project.
So this project might be something like cognition and emotion.
No, project is going after some aim, isn't it? No, it's not a mystery. Yeah, like project learning means it's the same as in that phrase, project learning. I'm not a teacher, right? Absolve myself of any mistakes I'm about to make. But basically, you discover something that the child wants to do, achieve. An answer, a question that they want the answer to. And say, okay, let's do that. Because then the child is committed to that project, and the process of realising that then is a learning process. Yeah? All of you here have some concept of how you'd like, I think, learning to be. Yeah? You've got some concept of education, and your own life is probably dedicated and driven in some sense, has a compass from that. I see a worry here.
Sorry, I just had a thought. So within the individual, that can be another concept in itself.
Yes, look, the individual reflects or acts as an action towards a concept or an idea, right? But what we're trying to get away from is the idea of a concept that simply exists within someone's head. But the thing is, a concept can't exist except by being in somebody's head. So the purpose of looking at a concept as being a way of thinking, which is in people's heads, you can't get away from that. I don't go along with, it's not inside, it's outside. Chop off a person's head, you get no concepts, you get no activity at all. Right? It's a way of life. I know that you can lie down in bed at the end of the night and just ruminate over things, even though you're doing nothing. But it's a little bit like the aftershock of an earthquake. Yeah? If you hadn't done anything for 10 years, there wouldn't be a lot of content in your ruminations. Right? And living human beings don't reflect the world in the sense that immediately. But there has to be some activity going on to give meaning to a thought. And a thought that doesn't return into the world in some form of activity is an abstract thought, it's not a real thought. I mean, I have dreams and all sorts of ideas flash by, but they never realise themselves. I never actually get to fly, I dream it often enough, right? So that's not really a concept. It's just something going on in your head, disembodied from a concept. But when it's your thought, your consciousness, which what's given to you immediately and only you, immediately, it's given to others indirectly by observing what you do, when that's connected to things and doings, then you have a concept. And by people watching what you do and making sense of it, which may involve asking you and querying you about why you're doing it, what's in your mind when you're doing that, or if they might intervene in it to test out your motives or whatever. So what's going on in your head is a part of what you're doing, yeah? And it's as accessible to other people. It's by its nature private to begin with, but nothing is given to the senses immediately. And so I should emphasise that. Nothing is given to the senses immediately. Everything we know thanks to mediation. That goes for the objects in the room around us, and it goes for what's in somebody else's mind. So consciousness is no different from any material thing in that sense. But what's in my mind, I have to recognise the distinction that has with the world, because I may think you're thinking something, right, but I may be quite wrong. What you're really thinking is a meaningful thought to me, right? So I see the little, querulous sort of look on your face, and I think there's something going on there. I'll ask, and then we find out. Yeah? So the threeness of this is important. Hegel is famous for the threeness of what he does. It's not unique to Hegel. Charles Sanders Peirce is great with his triads as well, and Vygotsky also used triads. Triads are about mediation. If you get a distinction between this and that, just left it itself, you can get nowhere with that. There has to be some mediation. So if you have an individual thinking a particular word or idea, if that's not mediated by participation in some activity, it's meaningless. Right? It's only when the two contrasted things, such as what the individual is doing and the word that they attach what they're doing to, if they're just left separately, it's meaningless. You have to connect them with an activity. And conversely, an activity that claims to be dedicated to some principle or idea or universal, if it doesn't have real individuals involved in that activity, I mean, for example, in substantial and real number, actually understanding the principles that do it, again, it's meaningless. So a concept requires all three. It requires words, instruments, tools, and things which we inherit from previous generations and connect us with that entire history of several million years of building up of culture, and using things in some way, appropriate or inappropriate to the words and things we're using. Okay, I think that's probably a good point to stop on that. We take a little break, is that okay? Yeah? And I'll stop my throat drying out. So if we're going to stop cameras, this is probably a good time to do it, and we'll start them again afterwards. And it's 5:12, so our tech man will be back very soon.
Is it true that Hegel Vygotsky took the mediation concept from him? I read somewhere.
Well, it could be. Hegel was very strong on the concept of mediation, and so was Vygotsky. One of the puzzles in this is I'm convinced that Vygotsky never read Hegel, right? But he worked with a lot of people who did read Hegel, and he read Marx, and he studied Marx deeply. He followed Lenin's writing. I suspect he was also a long-term reader of Plekhanov, who was a great populariser of Hegel as well, simply from the dates and what he was doing at the time and some of the phrases he uses. So, Hegel says right at the beginning of the science of logic, introducing the concept of being. Now, being to Hegel means that which is immediate and is unmediated. But he says right at the beginning, there is nothing in heaven or earth or anywhere else that is not both immediate and mediated. Now, that's the sort of thing that you write up in your bedroom wall and look at every so often, right? Because he's not saying just that everything is mediated. He's saying it's both immediate and mediated, right? So if a word mediates an idea for you, or helps you engage in some specific practice and to be oriented in it, you have to see that word or an image or something, and you have to sort of carry it with you. Right? So everything we have is given to us immediately, let's say sensuously. Right? For immediate, read sensuous. Right? For mediated, read conceptually. Yeah, in his early writings, Hegel used to refer to tools as concepts. Right? Now, I mean, if you've read Vygotsky, this is all very familiar kind of things, yeah? But I don't believe Vygotsky got this by reading Hegel, but I think it's unquestionable that was the source of this idea of mediation.